Todd, thank you for joining us today. You served in El Salvador during the Civil War nearly 40 years ago. Why is that Civil War still relevant today?
Oh, well, pleasure to be here. Yeah, that was a long time ago at the height of the Cold War with Ronald Reagan newly in office. And that was actually Reagan's first foreign policy crisis, Central America. It's hard to imagine today, but like Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, it was on the front pages every single day. And the way that the Reagan administration put it was they were going to draw the line against the Soviet Union in Central America, of all places. So, but that war, the war in El Salvador and the war in Nicaragua next door, where you had Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries supported by Cuba and the Soviet Union in power, in some ways defined what the Cold War was all about in a place very close to the United States. It wasn't very long after the war really started getting sharp in 1981 that Salvadorans, a lot of them former soldiers and guerrillas, started fleeing up to the United States to escape the violence in Central America.
And what were some of the misconceptions of the war in El Salvador at the time?
Well, in El Salvador, it wasn't just a revolutionary war versus a right-wing government supported by the United States. It was, of course, much more complex. It was effectively a civil war. And the impression that entered the United States was this was a war of repression against the people of El Salvador, somehow or other. But that was not actually the case. There had been a revolution in Nicaragua that overthrew a longtime US ally, Anastasio Somoza, and that put Marxist-Leninists into power. The next country, as a part of an intentional strategy, was to do the same thing in El Salvador. But when the left-wing guerrillas attempted an overthrow, they called it a final offensive, basically the people of El Salvador did not support them and did not just backed off. So the revolutionary organization called the FMLN, Frente Farabundo Martí de Liberación Nacional, withdrew primarily into the countryside and launched a long-term rural guerrilla insurgency. And that was the nature of the war for most of 10 years.
And what was life like for those residents in the rural areas when the violence started to really take off?
Well, most of the country was in conflict in one way or another. And I would say the guerrillas controlled about a third of the territory of El Salvador, mostly in isolated rural areas. But most of the people that lived there were not themselves guerrillas, like in other wars. They were interested just in carrying on their lives. These are mostly rural peasants who live semi-subsistence lives. So in a sense, they were caught in between the guerrillas on the one side and the government forces on the other.
Now we know, looking back, there were a lot of human rights violations during the war, and more recently, there's been a call for a former colonel in the government to face either war crimes or on trial or whatever the case is, because of the killing of 4 Dutch journalists. What happened in that case?
Well, the Dutch journalist case took place during a rise of violence. And in El Salvador, they called it the tiempos de locura, the crazy times, because nobody was really in control of the country. And you had the famous death squads, the Salvadoran death squads, who were going around killing anybody that they thought were communists. And their activities became associated with threats against foreign journalists. So the press corps was there in large numbers. both United American press and European, other parts of the world. And their names would show up on lists. So they knew it was very dangerous for journalists to be there, and a number had already been killed this early 1982. The Dutch journalists, though, there were 4 of them, and they had produced a film a couple of years earlier about El Salvador, and it was essentially propaganda in favor of the revolutionaries. So they were very much under suspicion. The head of the Treasury Police, the sort of the secret political police, called them in and quote unquote interviewed them for several hours. And essentially what they were doing was warning them that they should stop their activities, which was basically to make another propaganda film about the revolution.
Now, you have a very nuanced view about this, the call for justice to bring this former colonel before a court and so forth. Why is that? The Dutch journalists.
The Dutch journalists. So the Dutch journalists, in spite of having been warned, attempted to cross into guerrilla territory, accompanied by guerrilla guides, and they were ambushed and killed. And I was the investigating officer along with the military attaché, and we determined on the spot that they had been ambushed and killed by the Salvadoran forces. So the efforts to arrest and charge the colonel, who was the commander of the brigade that sent the patrol out to kill them, is being targeted and charged with war crimes. This is a case being taken in the Netherlands. This case still has a lot of political profile there. In 1992, when the Civil War ended, part of the agreement was to grant amnesty to military commanders and guerrilla commanders both for anything that happened during the war. But several years ago, the Supreme Court voided the amnesty, thereby making officers, any soldiers and officers, susceptible to these charges.
Now, you mentioned the refugees escaping the violence in El Salvador. We did see a number of refugees settle in Los Angeles, and not too long after that, we saw the birth of the MS-13 gang, formed in Los Angeles. Can you describe that gang?
Well, it was quite a surprise to me in I think it was 1993 or 1994, when I was working in the State Department. So this was long after my service on the ground in El Salvador. When we received from the Department of Justice a notification of deportation. And it was at the last minute, basically with 24 hours advance notice. And it had a list of Salvadorans, about 40 or 50 of them, as I recall, who had been convicted or were charged with felonies, having committed felonies in the United States. And this was a single flight coming out of Los Angeles, sending them back to El Salvador. They were, at the time, identified as gang members. So they were also, associated with gang investigation units in Los Angeles. And we didn't really know a lot about it, but what we did know from earlier times, as I said, was that a lot of these were people who had fled El Salvador originally, as most of them very young, some of them teenagers, who had gone up to Los Angeles, and because they knew how to use guns and had been part of armed violence, fell into the criminal sector rather than looking for regular employment, which is what most of the Salvadorans who were fleeing at the time were doing. And that was the sort of the core of the MS-13 and some other gangs who banded together on the model of Latino and African American gangs that were long established in LA and were essential for being able to protect themselves once they were in jail.
And what happened when MS-13, these gang members started going back to El Salvador?
So, well, we knew when we saw that very first Department of Justice deportation. So this is a charter plane flying, full of these guys, and we even saw there were even photos. We saw like identification document photos of those guys with those incredible tattoos, and it's not just their faces; it's their whole bodies. And I remember, discussing this, going, "Uh-oh, this isn't going to be good," because the Salvadoran government was not in any way prepared to receive, process, handle any of these guys. And it was basically sort of thinking about it now in retrospect, like injecting the phenomena of gang organization back into the country.
So how culpable is the U.S. in the spread of gang violence, not just in El Salvador, but Guatemala and Honduras, because of these deportations of violence they've learned in the U.S.?
Well, I think the way I look at it is that it's dynamic. So the notion that, all the Salvadorans fleeing up there, it's about keeping them out of the country, is playing on this fear of the other, fear of the foreign element that's going to come in and threaten us. But in fact, they exist in the way that they do because of the relationship with the United States and because of the role, their origins in the Civil War. So it's not to point a finger and say, those bad Salvadorans or those bad Hondurans or those bad Guatemalans, it's their fault, or to point a finger at the U.S. either. It's more to say that the United States was complicit in this, and that it is a dynamic relationship, and the conclusion that you can't help but arrive at it from that point of view is that both the United States and the Central American countries need to be part of resolving this and solving it.
And this includes the migrant crisis that we're seeing now.
The migrant crisis right now is I think, if to the extent you're talking about children accompanying parents, this is now the third generation of people who are coming. There is a substantial population, I think as everybody knows, of Central Americans in the United States who are well established, that are not just in Los Angeles, they exist all across the country with major concentrations of population. So they're now building on that. And the current crisis very much being provoked by long-term violence, by poverty, drug trafficking, also a major element, which again creates the dynamic with the United States, of course, because it's demand for drugs in the United States that drives the drug trafficking, not drug production that drives it.
And what do we misunderstand about El Salvador today?
What do we misunderstand about El Salvador? To the extent that it's colored by perceptions of the Cold War, vague memories of the death squads and this sort of thing, that it's colored by thoughts of violence, that we forget perhaps that El Salvador is a democracy, just had very interesting elections. There are large sectors of the population that are extremely dynamic, working. Their primary interest is in having a good life, just like everybody else. And the phenomena of gang violence fits in a long-term pattern of very high levels of violence associated with high density of population, poverty. These things have been existing for generations. So the possibility for some of the people to flee to the United States to seek better life, that's really what's driving this.
Well, Todd, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure to be here.